That's it? Okay, thanks. So Janina, the floor is yours.
Perfect. So thanks everybody for coming. We're really delighted to have as our guest presenter Burkard Eberlein. He is a professor of public policy and strategic management at the Schulich School of Business in York. That's at York University in Toronto, Canada. His current research focuses on the relationship between business and politics and on the political role of corporations, with a particular interest in the transnational governance of business conduct, the interplay of public and private governance modes, and comparative regulatory governance and policy, as well as energy and sustainability. He's published widely in journals such as Governance, Journal of Business Ethics, Journal of European Public Policy, Organization Studies, Public Administration and Regulation and Governance, so the whole gamut. Burkard is the recipient of various research grants awarded by agencies on both sides of the Atlantic, such as the EU, the German government, and also SSHRC, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And he also serves on the editorial board of Regulation and Governance. So welcome, Burkard. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be able to be with you this evening, I should say, your time this afternoon here in Toronto. So thank you so much, and I really look forward to this.
Great. So we wanted to start our discussion with just a first question, which is, from your personal experience, how do you identify new research questions, especially those that might have the potential to explore subfields that are new to our own crowd, or just in general widen the horizon of the things that we talk about?
Yes, thanks, Janina. That's an excellent question that we all confront at some point. So what I've found fruitful is to try to take a fresh perspective on a field and to tackle things that are sort of taken for granted in a field. And let me give one example of my earlier research on regulatory networks in the European Union. So the common wisdom was, so European integration is about vertical transfers of powers between the national and the supranational level, sort of the main focus. And I found interesting the literature on transgovernmental networks that came out of sort of more traditional IR literature. And I thought much of what's going on in the EU is more transnational than actually on that vertical axis between national and supranational. So it seems like a very simple and basic idea now, but I think at some point it helped redirect the discussion towards looking at those networks as agents of integration. So I think that might be a neat example. So how do you get there? I think a spirit of being contrarian a little bit, of saying, okay, this is kind of the received wisdom, or this is the main focus, and it does make sense, but I'm not happy with it. Another theme would be collaboration. So I did maybe have a few good ideas under the shower, but not that many, and not so the breakthrough ideas. They don't come to you sitting at home alone by yourself. They come through conversations, through collaborations, through looking beyond the plate of your own discipline. So I found interdisciplinary collaborations very important, and I actually regret not having collaborated more with people who are less like-minded. I think we have a tendency to work with people that we feel comfortable with. Oh yeah, Janina, she's also working on private governance. She's also interested in this, and she has a similar education, so I want to work with her. That's kind of the natural inclination. But I think we should seek out people that are not so obvious for us to work with, that will challenge us, that will take us into different directions. So I'll stop here at this point. We can develop some of this later on, I guess.
Perfect, absolutely. Thank you so much, Burkard. And we also wanted to say that we have some questions prepared, but obviously we also want to hear from the audience members. So if you have questions that you want to drop into the Q&A, we want to make sure that we do have sort of a conversation with Burkard, and then we also have the breakout sessions in our internal networking. So there will be time for both today. So let's say we have identified a promising idea. Do you typically try to start small and build up to a broader potential grant and or wider project over time, or do you start soon in trying to acquire resources in order to plant your flag with the maximum impact? So if we're thinking about, okay, what do we do with this little nugget of an idea? Which direction would you recommend us to follow?
Yeah, so there's no right or wrong answer here to this question, obviously. My preference has been more for the former, sort of to build slowly with smaller pieces, and I can give you two examples. The first is a SSHRC partnership grant that I held with Stepan Wood.
Mm.
Now at UBC, that sort of kicked off the transnational governance interactions agenda, and that led to the special issue finally at Regulation and Governance in 2014 that some of you, the private governance crowd, is familiar with, not everybody else. So the way we started this was really with a very small grant between our two schools at York University. So there was a joint center between business and law, and we got really a very small amount of money to host a workshop. And we really started bottom up by inviting lots of people with some interest in the very general topic of interactions between, traditional regulation and novel forms of regulation, and going really broadly, different disciplines. Again, the idea of interdisciplinarity, and then building this up. We had another workshop, a larger one. Again, really canvassing ideas, creating a network, and then building on this, building a grant application. And by the time you have a network, you have people who sign on to the grant application, and you have more certainty about we are on to something, right? There is something here because, if the response to your invitation is positive and people find something valuable, that's indication that there's potential. And from a strategic perspective, if you bring a lot of people on board that sign on to your agenda, likelihood is that people who will review this at some point will have had some connection with that network and will be inclined at least to find this potentially interesting. So I think there's merit in building this bottom up. Sort of second example is a grant that I just was awarded again by the Canadian agency SSHRC on global sustainability standards in national context. Where we look at business government interactions in two sectors, mining and in soybean, agribusiness, and in three countries, Argentina, Brazil, and Canada. So it's a brand new project, very excited about it. And again, thank you. And again, beginning with a framework paper. So this is a project with a great colleague from Concordia University, Jose Carlos Marquez, and we wrote a conceptual paper that really laid the groundwork for this, that served as a kind of springboard. So we had that paper in the works, and that was really the frame for the grant application, right? So that gave us grounding, that gave us some legitimacy. So in the grant application, we could point to a forthcoming paper. We had done a lot of pre-research. So again, building up in small steps, not thinking, oh, wow, I have this great idea and I need immediately to apply for the super duper grant before someone else steals the idea or runs away with that. So that's just my experience. This might work, but I felt in those two examples, what really helped me was building up slowly and with small initial grants, with workshops, with creating a network, with one conceptual paper on which then you can build an agenda for a grant application.
Great, thank you so much. You said before that in order to come up with new ideas, you have to be a little bit contrarian sometimes. And my next question goes into that vein. So what would be your best tips to junior researchers who do aim to innovate, but also in that innovation might be moving into areas that are less established or perceived as more risky versus building onto the agenda and the research theories that are, center in the discipline and making sort of incremental improvements in that vein?
Yeah, so there's a bit of a conundrum, and I'm jumping ahead maybe to something that we also have the agenda on, sort of what is novelty? You know, can we come up with something new at all? And there's a bit of a conundrum here, and I don't know, some of you might be aware of this adage which says to any new paper at workshops, whatever, either it's new but not true, or it's true but not new. So we are sort of between a rock and a hard place, right? So you come with a paper and say, people, yeah, that's all very interesting, but you know, oh, Smith, 1973 has already said that and studied, you know, like, oh, shoot, I didn't know about that. Great. So we can't escape that conundrum. I think one way I think about it, everything has been said. I think that's true, right? I mean, it's very difficult to make truly breakthrough innovations, but that's not the only way to make good contributions. Let me give you a few ideas. So I think there in the literature typically different cycles of attention, and there are pendulum swings, right? And I think one strategy to be innovative is to be aware of those and to be maybe a bit slightly ahead of the curve, or anticipate this, or ride the wave in the right places. So example, again, I can come back to the private governance literature. So, you know, we have the typical cycle in the beginning. There's, wow, lots of excitement about, wow, the potential of private governance is great. And everybody runs into the field and finds more examples of how exciting and valuable and important this is. And obviously, at one point, the pendulum swings back and people come and say, well, it's not working that well. And what about the state and the role of the state? I've always believed that, you know, to think of private governance as, wow, private governance in isolation has always been a mistake in my view, but okay, now we are back. Now the pendulum has swung back. Now everybody's talking about, and we, in our research projects, we're talking about the role of the state and how this plays together, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this was in some ways predictable, right? So you could have written an innovative piece 2 or 3 years ago and say, you know, buyer beware, or, you know, the looming gap. I mean, so, and I think this is an opportunity for you. Then I think there are different ways to innovate. So I would maybe distinguish 3 ways. One is sort of, there's a new empirical phenomenon, and that's what often drives sort of research by more junior researchers. So you dig deep in your PhD, you dig deep into a new phenomenon. You're the first one to, you know, okay, I counted all the, excuse the pun, Janina, I counted all the beans in this sector, in this country, and I know it inside. I can tell you everything about this case, right? Which is an accomplishment in and of itself. But of course, people will say, well, you know, what are the larger implications? But, you know, let's not diminish this. It can be a contribution to have investigated one particular specific case to a certain depth and, you know, up to date. I think that is an accomplishment. You always have to remember, of course, why would people want to look or be interested in this? So, you know, what are the wide implications? But that could be a contribution. The second one could be a new methodological contribution. So you have a familiar phenomenon, you're using established theoretical frameworks, but you apply new methodology, right? So someone in a field where ethnographic research is not very widespread. I mean, some examples that maybe come to mind, like in European integration research, sometimes you have the odd sociologist or anthropologist that comes in and who does sort of more traditional anthropological ethnographic work. And people find this exciting, and it's a contribution to, okay, we're all tired of the rational choice explanation of what the European Commission does or doesn't do. And here comes an ethnographic perspective, right, to investigate this field. So that can be exciting. We all want to make this wonderful, big conceptual theoretical contribution. That's the prize, the big prize, right? But that is the most challenging one at the same time. So I think the most realistic way is to think, Well, it's a cumulative exercise. And it's more, the contribution is, I would think, in terms of, I have some exciting in-depth work maybe coming out of my dissertation that is, empirical based, that is very phenomenon driven, that is currency driven. But I have a sense of how this speaks to a certain larger issue. I think this connection sometimes get lost in very deep empirical projects, right? So my question would always be, which conversation are you trying to join? What is your audience, right? And I think getting out of the weeds every once in a while is very important, and ask yourself the question, who on earth would be interested in the 1,000 beans I've counted in my research, right? So who's my audience? Who can get excited about this? What is the conversation? I think maybe that's the most useful. What is the conversation that I'm joining here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we know there are several going on here, and I just sold you the benefits of interdisciplinary and being contrarian, maybe importing concepts from other disciplines. But at the end of the day, and from a pragmatic strategic perspective, especially junior researchers need to ask themselves the question, who will publish my research, right? And that's a bit of a challenge for this boundary crossing research, like private governance research, because it's, I've published in law journals, yes, I've published in organizational journals, political science journals, but they all have different ideas of what they want, right? And to tailor. So that is a bit of a challenge. So don't get too nervous about, am I making this great theoretical contributions? I think there's innovation at different levels. And the question is really, what is the purpose of a specific piece that is coming out of it, and which conversation am I trying to join?
That's very interesting. Thank you so much, Burkard. I'll take the prerogative of asking one last question. And since we've already covered the ones that we're prepared, I'm going to go beyond this. And then I would also encourage people who might have a question to Burkard. Maybe we'll take 2 or 3 questions before we move into the breakout group. So please raise your hand. The hand raising tool is in when you go to reaction, so we can line you up. And then we're interested to hear what your questions would be. And mine is just a very short one, but it builds on what you were saying before, which is that potentially having a phenomenon-driven research agenda could be risky, as you're never seen to be creating or making your research agenda about the theoretical contribution that might be expected in certain disciplines. And I know that in business, I'm going to be joining a business school. This is particularly of relevance. So would you say that that is more risky, and or if we do find the phenomenon more interesting than necessarily the individual theory, how do we guard against being seen as somebody who just like follows the flag wherever it goes? I guess I don't know whether that is the right metaphor, but die Fahne im Wind in German. Yeah.
Well, if you mean you're doing this if you're phenomenon driven, or if you just look out for
potentially, right? Because then you're contributing, if you're making a theoretical contribution, you're contributing it potentially in different fields, because your phenomenon sort of defines the theoretical contribution that you can make at any given point in time.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about this. So I think, a phenomenon can be put to use in various ways, right? I mean, there's some disciplines that, and management or business schools really prize, articles and, with the theoretical contribution, right? So that is part of the packaging, or you won't get into the journals, even if it's a very exciting, truly innovative empirical research. If you don't connect to the theoretical conversation, it's not going to be published. Other disciplines are more forgiving and more welcoming to just saying, oh, well, this is an exciting, methodologically innovative empirical research, and it has its own merits. But it doesn't have to be in contradiction. I think every phenomenon, has potential to to be exploited to shed light on some discussion, right?
Mm.
I think you just have to look at what are different conversations out there for which this is relevant, right?
Mm.
Once you've done it, it's too late. Once you've done it, you just ask the question, so, which conversations can I join here with the insights that I've generated?
Okay.
I'm not
Great.
sure I answered your question, but
Yeah, no, it gives me a little bit more confidence. Anyway, I see that Conrad also has a question. Maybe you just want to unmute yourself. Yeah.
So thank you, Burkard, for this introduction. And what I wanted to ask is you addressed the tension between sort of novelty and contrarianness, and then, of course, getting published. But I was wondering what your thoughts are on the much earlier stage of sort of novelty and contrarianness and getting funded, especially for new career researchers who are, young whippersnappers who have no right to ask questions in the minds of some scholars, right? So in Janina's words, perhaps from an earlier conversation, this paradox, right, between novelty and funding, as well as novelty and publishing.
Mm.
Yeah, thank you, Conrad. It's a great question, and it's true. I sort of skipped a little bit the early stage. Can I get funded for really exciting but maybe outlandish stuff? Okay, I guess that's a bit the question. So I think the reviewers who tend to be more senior will always look for, do you have a good understanding of the conversation that's been going on for whatever the period is? So it should be framed in a way that you signal, yes, folks, I know about this, right? It shouldn't be something that a reviewer says, oh, Smith 1973, boom, shoots you down, right? It should be something you signal, I know about this, but there's something that bugs me about the common wisdom, right? There's something that is maybe, and I think the most exciting things are when things are so glaringly obvious, but nobody has picked it up because they think it's too glaringly obvious, for example, right?
Mm.
So it could be something very simple. It could be a shift in perspective. And I try to give this example about, European integration is doesn't run along the vertical axis, it runs along the horizontal axis, right? It's a very simple, it's nothing new, right? It's not something you could, it's just shifting the lens a little bit. Or you import, I think what works for some people, especially in the management field, I found out myself, that here are the organizational management folks, and they just go to the political science literature, example CSR, and import the concept of citizenship. And then they make a big splash about something that we find, okay, yeah, citizenship, we know about that. But it makes a splash in their discipline because they're saying things using a lens that hasn't been used before, or they're shifting, you're just shifting a little bit. But always do this on that's the boring literature review part. That's the, there are 3 streams and this and that, but then point to something that is, I think it's more exciting than, here's this wonderful edifice. And I found this little puzzle piece that is maybe missing in quadrant 7F, right? That's not so exciting, right? It's exciting is to say, well, we thought too much in terms of 1A and 7F. I want to move the whole board around and look at it in different ways. Like bring the ethnographic perspective to something that has never been looked at that way, or, stuff like that. Does that capture a little bit of?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would say there is in my circles, it's called the reviewer 2 problem. But I find often when trying to do that, right, when trying to thread that needle of, I'm doing something radical and exciting, but actually I am worshiping at the feet of the people who came before. You get, rather than reviews that are all, sort of one mind, right? You get grant reviews where I had a really interesting one where I had 7 reviews for something that normally had 3, and 2 of them were like, "You have no idea what you're talking about." 3 of them were like, "You know exactly what you're talking about." And a couple of them were like, "Why am I reviewing this? There's already been 5 people." So some of this is irreducible. I get that. Any tips about heading off or sort of weaving between those two, where there's always, Smith 73 and, Jones or Rappaport, 2003. There's always another piece of literature that someone's going to bring in. Any tips about heading off? People who are like, well, this literature, but not this literature.
Guess what? If I knew, I would have, used it already and won all the grants possible. So I think it's a conundrum. It's the same with the review process, the review 2 problem that you mentioned. So there's no easy escape. And all I can say, again, different agencies have different policies and different journals handle things differently. So there's no easy escape on that. I think you just try to cover all the bases, and review 2 is review 2. You can't escape that. Sorry. If I knew, I would tell you.
That would be the truly revolutionary research right there.
Yes, but sorry, I don't have the recipe for that.
That's okay. You've already given us really, really good advice anyway. I think Flavia has another question.
Yes, thank you, Burkard. These are really interesting points. So my question is, when you're an early career academic, do you choose to join like broader conversations like political science journals or public policies, or would you go for more specific specialized areas such as regulation? Like, do we keep it broad as possible to like include as many papers, journals as possible, or do you focus and go with a narrower field?
Great question. I'm not sure there's a clear answer here. I think your dissertation will push you sort of in the more specialized area, and I think many folks here are, working broadly in regulatory governance, and I think that's a large enough field already, and it branches out across several disciplines. Again, I would think about in terms of audience, and audience meaning, it could be groups like this one, the ECPR Standing Group in Regulatory Governance is a conversation, an important conversation, but also in terms of journals, right? Do you want to publish in sort of more public policy journals, in general political science journals, still other journals? So I would, again, think about who's the audience here and what is, you need some for study, you need some depth, some specialization, and that will narrow down, the number of venues for which this is interesting. I'm sorry, I don't have a very clear answer, but I would lean more towards specialization. And it's more ambitious to say, okay, I work on a specific regulatory governance problem, and maybe a true first success would be to get into one of the specialized journals, and maybe regulation and governance is a bit more than a specialized journal, but it is still specialized. But I'm not shooting immediately to get into the British Journal of Political Science, right? With my very specialized regulatory governance research, just to give an example.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Great. Thank you so much, Burkard. This is really insightful. And I think there's no more questions. So we'll move on to the next element of this session. Again, thank you so much for taking the time. I think we'll also stop the recording now, so we have a little bit more freedom to brainstorm and ideas. Thanks for taking the time. And I think we also